The year was 1066. Across the cold stretch of the North Sea, the last true Viking king was readying himself for what would become the final act in the saga of Norse conquest. His name was Harald Hardrada, and he was far from an ordinary warrior. This was the same man who once led the Byzantine emperor's elite guard, seized Sicily from Arab control, and earned both fortune and fame on battlefields across 3 continents. Now, in the chill of September, he set his sights on England. But Harald wasn't making the voyage alone. At his side stood a man whose presence turned the invasion into something far more personal. His own exiled brother, Tostig Godwinson. It was family turned against family. Betrayal, vengeance, and the fight for the English crown were about to collide in a single savage battle. One so fierce it would close the door on an entire era. This is the story of Stamford Bridge, where Viking dreams sank into the mud, where Englishmen fought Englishmen, and where the roar of Norse warriors ended in blood and fire. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval warfare. It's a desperate gamble, the moment the old world smashed headlong into the new. For centuries, the Vikings had ruled by fear, but this time, they would meet their reckoning. At the center of it all stood Harald Hardrada, nearly 7 feet tall, a giant even among giants. His scarred hands had gripped swords from 3 continents. His pale eyes had watched empires rise and crumble. The Byzantines had called him the Thunderbolt of the North. To his enemies, he was colder than winter, harder than steel. He wasn't just another raider. He was the last Viking flame still burning in a world that had begun to move on. Before claiming his throne, Harald had roamed the medieval world as both mercenary and conqueror. He had led the emperor's own Varangian guard in Constantinople, battled Arab pirates in the Mediterranean, and fought alongside Norman knights in Sicily. His wealth was legendary, his reputation unmatched. Every drop of blood he spilled brought him closer to this very moment. But Norway alone couldn't satisfy the fire that drove him. He dreamed of restoring the empire once held by King Canute, a realm stretching from Norway to Denmark to England. Yet the path that led him here was marked by betrayal. When Harald sat beside Tostig Godwinson, once Earl of Northumbria, the longships behind them cut through the water like blades. He was in England now, and the story of how 2 brothers became enemies was written in pride, politics, and power. Tostig had ruled Northumbria with a heavy hand, enforcing harsh order on a land tired of his rule. By 1065, his people had had enough. They rose in rebellion, declared him an outlaw, and chose another man to lead them. When the rebels marched south demanding his removal, they faced his own brother, Harald Godwinson, soon to be king, who stood before an impossible choice. England needed peace, not another civil war. Harald chose survival. He convinced King Edward the Confessor to accept the rebels' demands. Tostig was stripped of his lands, branded an outlaw, and sent into exile. When the brothers finally met, the air must have crackled with anger. Tostig accused Harald of betraying him, of stirring the rebellion himself. Harald saw his decision as necessary. Tostig saw only treachery. Furious and humiliated, Tostig began plotting his revenge. He reached out to Harald Hardrada, and together they forged a pact born of ambition and vengeance. Harald wanted England. Tostig wanted payback. Together, they would rip the kingdom apart. That summer, in 1066, Norway gathered a fleet the likes of which Europe had never seen. 300 longships packed with 9,000 warriors, their dragon-headed prows glinting in the sun. Axes and swords, already red from 100 wars, waited for more blood. These men had never known defeat. They had conquered from Russia to Sicily and carried the confidence of generations of raiders. But this was no ragtag band of plunderers. Harald's army was professional, disciplined, and deadly, hardened veterans who had fought with him in Byzantine campaigns and in the long, brutal wars between Norway and Denmark. They carried round shields painted with black ravens and wore mail shirts that shimmered like silver scales. Their voices were rough, born of the frozen north, and when they sang their war songs, it sounded like wolves howling across the sea. As September winds filled their sails, Harald's fleet crossed the North Sea. They stopped first at the Orkney Islands, gathering more men before turning south toward England. Smoke and steel marked their arrival, Norsemen storming coastal villages, burning homes, and demanding tribute. Villages saw the smoke long before the warriors arrived. The fleet glided into the Humber River like a serpent sliding deep into England's heart. Their prize was York, the great northern city, a gateway to ruling all the north. But before York could fall, the Vikings had to face England's defenders, two young earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria. They led about 3,000 men north, desperate to stop the invasion before it could spread. On September 20th, 1066, the armies clashed at Fulford Gate, just outside York. Edwin and Morcar charged head-on, their banners whipping in the wind. For a moment it looked like their courage might hold, but Harald Hardrada was no stranger to war. He let the English advance into the marsh, where the ground swallowed their footing and their strength. Then, with the precision of a born commander, Harald struck back. His shield wall surged forward like an iron tide. Axes bit into shields, steel split armor, and the field shook under the roar of battle. Hours passed in slaughter. The English fought with heart, but Harald's veterans fought with experience. By the time it ended, the ground was thick with bodies. Hundreds drowned in the marsh. The rest were cut down. The earls barely escaped alive. York surrendered without resistance. The citizens opened their gates, hoping mercy would spare them. Harald and Tostig entered the ancient city as victors. The north was theirs, its people terrified, its tribute promised, and the road to the English crown lay open before them. But far to the south, King Harald Godwinson received the news that would change everything. For months, he had waited for William of Normandy's invasion along the southern coast. Now came word of a different threat. His own exiled brother had returned, leading the greatest Viking army the world had ever seen. In Westminster's Great Hall, Harald stood over a table of maps, candlelight flickering across his tired face. His advisors whispered, weighing impossible choices. 2 invasions, 2 directions, both ready to strike at the heart of his kingdom. For months, he had watched the channel, waiting for Normandy's sails to appear. William's claim to the throne was backed by the Pope himself, and the danger from the south was real. But now York had fallen, and Edwin and Morcar's forces were broken. Their defeat scattered like autumn leaves across the north. Harald Hardrada had done what no Viking had achieved in generations, carved a foothold into English soil. His invasion pushed toward London, drawn by its gold, power, and crown. Harald Godwinson didn't have the luxury of hesitation. This was his land, his people, his kingdom. No matter what Normandy or Norway claimed, England belonged to him, and he would fight to prove it. The south would have to wait. The real danger was in the north, in York, where a towering Viking king sat demanding tribute and hostages. I drew a long breath and gave the order. Messengers galloped through the night, carrying commands that would echo for centuries. Rally the men. Call every shire. March north now. What followed was one of the most extraordinary marches in medieval history. From London to York stretched nearly 200 miles of rough, muddy tracks and rolling hills. Most armies would have taken weeks to cover that distance with their baggage trains and supply wagons. But mine moved like a storm. At the heart of the army were my housecarls, professional warriors bound by oath, men who had sworn to die beside me. Their chainmail glimmered like wet silver, their long-handled axes sharp enough to split shields. Behind them came the FYRD, common men summoned from farms and villages across southern England, farmers who traded plows for blades, craftsmen whose steady hands now gripped hammers of war, merchants carrying spears instead of scales. We marched day and night, following the old Roman roads that still stitched England together. Every dawn brought more men from loyal shires. By the time we reached Yorkshire, nearly 7,000 of us were on the move, exhausted, blistered, but ready to fight for home. Up north, the Norwegians had grown careless. Harald Hardrada, proud of his victory at Fulford just 5 days earlier, believed no English force could challenge him for weeks. York had already agreed to his terms. Hostages and tribute were to be delivered at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east, across the quiet Derwent River. It was supposed to be a peaceful exchange. Many of his men stayed behind to guard the ships and treasure at Rickcall, along with English hostages. Those who followed Hardrada to Stamford Bridge carried only light gear, expecting ceremony, not war. The morning was unusually warm for late September. Chainmail that once felt comfortable under a sea breeze now baked under the sun. Many Norwegians left their armor behind. Even Hardrada himself wore only a blue silk shirt, confident his name alone was protection enough. His great mail hauberk hung elsewhere, unused. At his side rode Tostig, eager to reclaim the earldom he'd lost. To him, this was more than an alliance, it was revenge. Cast out by his brother, he'd chosen betrayal over forgiveness. Now, with the might of Norway behind him, he saw a chance to reclaim his lands, maybe even the English crown itself. Stamford Bridge was a peaceful spot, a timber and stone crossing over the Derwent, its banks shaded by old willows where shepherds watered their flocks. That morning it would become a killing ground, the stage for the Vikings' final act. As the sun rose higher and no English nobles appeared with tribute, unease spread through the camp. Scouts rode in, reporting dust clouds to the west. Hardrada waved them off, thinking they were just messengers. He couldn't have been more wrong. Through the night, my army had marched the last miles, pushing past exhaustion and pain. At dawn, we reached York, smashing through the small Norwegian garrison still left there. By the time their alarm was raised, it was already too late. From a distance, I could see the raven banners fluttering above Stamford Bridge. Hardrada's camp, scattered and unprepared. His men were divided, half-armored, unaware of the storm bearing down on them. For a king who'd spent his life seizing opportunity the moment it appeared, I knew this was it. The prey had called itself the trap of destiny, and that morning, as my army formed its ancient shield wall beneath the pale light, every man knew this was the moment. We weren't just defending England. We were ending 3 centuries of Viking terror that had haunted our shores. Across the bridge, the last great Viking king waited. Today would decide whether England would belong to Norse raiders or English kings. The air hung thick with fate. On the quiet slopes of Stamford Bridge, 2 worlds faced each other. The old and the new, ready to collide in a storm that would shake all of Europe. What had begun as a tribute meeting was about to become a bloodbath. The Norwegians, caught between pride and panic, scrambled to form ranks. Many still wore only light tunics, their mail left behind in the September heat. Hardrada's voice thundered across the field as he tried to rally his scattered men, calling them into the same shield wall that had carried Vikings to victory for generations. But my army came on like a gathering storm. For days of relentless marching had hardened us beyond exhaustion. Every man knew what was at stake. My housecarls stood in the center, spears braced, axes ready. On the flanks, farmers and craftsmen, men who had traded hammers and plows for weapons, took their place beside them. This was no longer an army of soldiers. It was a nation standing together. Across the field, the Viking line bristled with steel and banners. It was a magnificent sight and a terrifying one. These were warriors who had conquered half the known world. But I could see their weakness. They were unarmored, unready, their ranks scattered. At their center stood Harald Hardrada, towering above his men, the Thunderbolt of the North himself. Even caught off guard, he radiated command. His pale eyes scanned our banners, measuring distances, weighing his odds. He had faced worse, in the deserts of Sicily, the mountains of Anatolia, and would not back down now. Then came the riders. 20 of my horsemen trotted across the wooden bridge under a banner of truce. The lead voice called out, demanding to know if Earl Tostig was among them. The answer came, proud and defiant. Yes, Tostig was here, and he would not hide from his brother. What followed was one of the most powerful moments in English history. I offered him peace, his lands restored, his wealth returned, even a share of the kingdom, if he abandoned the Norwegians and came home. For a heartbeat, the world held still. 2 brothers, divided by pride and betrayal, stood on opposite banks of the same river. One defending England, the other about to destroy it. Then came Tostig's answer, cold and final. He would not yield. When Hardrada asked what reward he'd get for his efforts, my answer became legend: 7 feet of English ground, since he's taller than most men. The message was clear. His reward would be death and burial on English soil. When the messengers returned, both sides knew the time for words was over. Hardrada, impressed by my resolve, asked who had spoken. When told it was Harald Godwinson himself, the Viking king nodded. This, he said, was an enemy worthy of a king. The Norwegians began to tighten their ranks. Veterans who had fought from Russia to Jerusalem fell into old rhythms. Shields locked, spears leveled, and their battle chants rose. Songs of Odin and Valhalla, howls rolling across the field like winter wind. But my men didn't flinch. Our own voices answered, not with fear, but with defiance. We sang of green fields and ancient soil, of home and hearth, of the England we swore to protect. 2 armies stood face to face, the past and the future, and the world held its breath. This was their land, their inheritance, and no foreign king, no matter how tall or fierce, would take it from them. The battle began not with grand strategy, but with a single act of courage that would echo through time. As we advanced toward the bridge, our path was blocked by a lone Norwegian, a giant wielding a massive 2-handed axe. He planted his feet in the middle of the narrow span and dared any man to cross. What followed belonged more to legend than war. The warrior stood alone, cutting down man after man with brutal precision. His axe rose and fell like a machine, steel ringing against steel. Arrows glanced off his mail, blows shattered on his shield. Still he held his ground, buying precious time for his comrades to form their line. For long, terrible minutes the bridge belonged to him. Then one of our men found another way. Crawling beneath the planks in a small boat, he thrust his spear upward through the boards. The giant roared once and fell, his blood turning the Derwent red. The way was open. Our army surged across like a tide, voices rising in a roar that shook the valley. Ahead, the Norwegians locked their shields, the ancient wall that had carried their ancestors to glory. When we struck, the impact was thunder. Shields splintered, spears shattered, and men fell where they stood. The Norwegians, though caught off guard, fought like lions. Their line held through the first assault, axes sweeping, swords flashing in deadly rhythm. Many had fought for emperors in Constantinople and crushed Arab cavalry in the south. Now they fought not for conquest, but for survival. My housecarls drove forward with brutal discipline, long axes cleaving through mail and bone. Behind them came the Fyrd farmers defending their fields, merchants their homes. Every man fought like it was his own blood on the line. Under the blazing sun, the battle raged for hours. Harald Hardrada fought in the front rank, his great sword carving wide arcs through the chaos, his voice booming orders above the clash of steel. Beside him, Tostig fought like a man possessed, desperate to justify his betrayal, determined to win back his lost crown. But slowly the Viking line began to break. Without armor, the Norwegians felt the full weight of English steel. Cracks split their shield wall, and my warriors poured through like water through a broken dam. The end came suddenly. An English arrow, fired from somewhere in the press, slipped between Hardrada's helmet and collar. The Thunderbolt of the north fell, the ground shaking beneath him. His black raven banner dipped toward the blood-soaked earth. With their king dead, the heart went out of the Norwegians. Tostig tried to rally them, swinging his sword through the smoke, but it was hopeless. The shield wall crumbled. The retreat turned to panic. Men fled toward their ships at Rickcall, hunted by our cavalry. The slaughter was terrible, but the victory was complete. The Viking Age, which had begun in fire and thunder, ended here, beneath an English sky.